Mm. 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 Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
Open a channel.
With your permission, sir?
Permission granted. On my mark. Engage.
Engage impulse engines. Engage. Engage.
Engage!
Engage. 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 Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Captain.
Engage emergency override.
Engage.
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 Engage forward shields, 35%.
Engage.
Engage the cloaking device.
Engage.
Of them.
Engage them in conversation.
Engage. Engage.
Welcome to TR News, your home for transnational rationale. Join today's trek through the stars, illuminated from the oil of a proverbial blessed olive tree, neither from the Oriental nor the Occidental. Truth guides its purveyors to the light, and truth, derived from reason, is omniscient. I'm your telepathic rhetorician, and this is today's world news without the spin. Anti-Ukraine war Brazilian President Lula da Silva keeps the same energy in Washington. AP News and Reuters, The Hill, a few other outlets reported that democracy was at the forefront of the agenda for Lula in D.C. Multiple headlines. At the same time, Lula and Biden had disagreements on certain issues, including Ukraine. And this article is from the World Socialist website, WSWS.org. It explains the Ukraine situation. The background and implications of the 2014 far-right coup in Kiev, which overthrew the pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych, is critical for understanding the current Ukraine-Russia war. This coup was only supported by U.S. and European imperialism and implemented primarily by far-right shock troops, such as the Right Sector and the neo-Nazi Svoboda Party. It represented the temporary culmination of long-standing efforts by U.S. imperialism to install a puppet regime on the borders of Russia and brought the world a major step closer to war between the largest nuclear powers. The U.S. and Russia, Ukraine has since been systematically built up as a launching pad for a NATO war against Russia. This regime, or the regime change, prompted the outbreak of an ongoing civil war in the east of Ukraine between Russian-backed separatists and the U.S.-backed Ukrainian army, and it's claimed the lives of tens of thousands and displaced millions. In the U.S., the coup was a catalyzer for an ever more aggressive campaign against Russia and a significant shift to the right among layers of the upper middle class. U.S. imperialism and NATO have funded the Ukrainian state and far-right forces with billions of dollars. The German ruling class seized upon the coup as a pretext for aggressively stepping up its campaign to remilitarize and justify the crimes of fascist forces. For the first time since the end of World War II, representatives of a German government were seen on photos with avowed Ukrainian neo-Nazis. Internationally pseudo-left forces such as the Internationalist Socialist Organization, ISO, in the US, the new Anti-Capitalist Party of France, and the Russian Socialist Movement supported the coup, falsely proclaiming it a revolution. The ICFI and the WSWS alone advanced a principled socialist opposition to the imperialist operation, warning the working class of its dangerous consequences. So there we have the context of the Ukraine in reference to democracy. So we have Lula meeting Biden, and they discuss democracy. Here's another article involving Brazil and Ukraine particularly. Something to elucidate the position of Brazil on Ukraine. And this is from Tasnim News Agency. This was reported just a few days ago, the 28th, weeks ago. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva refused to consider an option to send tank ammunition to Germany over concerns that these shells could be handed over to Ukraine. The Folha de Sao Paulo reported Friday. According to the report, the decision was made on January 20th during the meeting with top military. Make that a little bigger. During the meeting with top military, command ahead of the resignation of Ground Forces Commander Julio Cesar de Arruda. According to the report, it was Arruda who raised the question of sending ammunition to Germany during the meeting, TASS reported. The Brazilian leader justified his rejection by arguing that one should not provoke the Russians. According to the newspaper, the shells in question are ammunition for Leopard 1 tanks. This is not the first time Germany attempted to reach an agreement with Brazil on handing over or the handover of German-made weapons to Ukraine. Last year, Berlin was denied to buy ammunition for a Gepard air defense system. I think those are tank systems that protect against drones, like an anti-drone systems. Yep, so this idea that Lula refused to consider sending these things over to Germany in support of fighting Ukraine. Super important. And here we have Lula and Brazil and Lula and Biden meeting up.
Presidente Biden.
Well, Mr. President Biden.
Além de recolocar o Brasil
besides repositioning Brazil
na nova geopolítica mundial,
in the new world geopolitics,
porque o Brasil se isolou durante 4 anos,
because Brazil isolated itself for 4 years,
eu tinha 3 coisas primeiro para lhe dizer.
I had 3 things to say to you,
Primeiro,
sir.
agradecer
First of all, to thank you
a
very much
solidariedade sua no reconhecimento da minha posse como
for
presidente da
your
República.
solidarity and for acknowledging my when I was sworn in office.
Segundo,
Second,
o reconhecimento pela sua postura em defesa da democracia.
I want to acknowledge your posture in the defense of democracy.
E por último, lhe dar os parabéns
And last but not the least, to
pelo
congratulate you
discurso de antes de ontem,
because of your speech to the State of the Union 2 days ago.
que é um discurso que cairia muito bem se fosse feito no Brasil.
It would fit very well if that speech was made in Brazil.
O senhor sabe que o Brasil ficou 4 anos se auto-marginalizando.
You know, Mr. President, that Brazil self-marginalized
Presidente
itself for
que não
4 years.
gostava de manter relações com nenhum país.
The former president didn't enjoy to keep international relations with any
O
country.
mundo dele terminava e começava com a fake news.
His world started and ended with
De
fake
manhã,
news.
de tarde e à
In the
noite.
morning, afternoon, and at night.
Ele me parece que menosprezava relações
It
internacionais.
seems that he despised international relations.
Sounds familiar. E o Brasil é um país que não tem contencioso com ninguém.
And Brazil
And I have to say, and I didn't play the Biden portion before this, but the difference between the two is glaring. Lula is affectionate. His mannerisms are alluring. I don't get that same thing from Biden.
is a country that has no soever any litigation with any country in the
O
world.
Brasil é um país em que o povo gosta de paz,
Brazil
de
is a country
democracia,
that people enjoy peace,
de trabalhar,
democracy, work,
de carnaval,
and carnival,
de samba,
and samba,
sabe? E de muita alegria.
and a lot of joy.
E é esse Brasil que nós estamos tentando recolocar no mundo.
This is the Brazil that we're trying to reposition in the world.
Os Estados Unidos representam muito na relação com o Brasil.
The U.S. has a lot
Na
of meaning for
relação
the relations with
histórica,
Brazil. It's
na
an
relação
historical
histórica, relação
relationship,
política,
political
relação
relationship,
econômica e comercial.
economic and a trade,
E
strong trade
muito,
relationship,
e muito na relação cultural.
and very much so in the cultural
Nós
relationship.
agora temos alguns problemas para trabalharmos juntos.
Now we have some problems, some issues that we have to work together.
Primeiro,
First of all,
nunca mais permitir
never more allow
que haja um novo capítulo do Capitólio
that there should be a new chapter written again on the Capitol invasion here.
e que nunca mais haja o que aconteceu no Brasil.
Man, that's one of the things that I've not covered in this story that we may cover in the future, is the parallels between the Brazilian, I don't know what to call it, but maybe the J6 version of Brazil's far right might be a good name for it, but there are extreme parallels, and it was an international uproar. And whether or not it was justified is something that we can continue to be thinking about.
Brasil,
And never more should happen what happened in Brazil,
com a invasão do Congresso Nacional,
of the invasion of the National Congress,
do Palácio do Presidente e da Suprema
the
Corte.
President's Palace, and the Supreme Court building.
A segunda coisa que temos que trabalhar junto é o combate à desigualdade.
The second thing that we should work together, is to fight inequality,
A questão racial,
the racial issue.
que de vez em quando eu vejo ela ser praticada em todos os países,
And I see that once in a
Nos
while this
Estados
is
Unidos.
practiced racism in the U.S. and many other countries in the world.
e no Brasil.
Yeah, and Lula is he was in office for a while, and if I'm not mistaken, the Brazilian government outlawed racism while he was in office. He left office, was arrested, was in prison for about a year, and was released, and is now in office again.
And in Brazil too,
Sobretudo a periferia jovem, os jovens negros da periferia,
especially the youth, the black
São
youth that live
vítimas
in the
muitas
periphery
vezes
in Brazil.
são vítimas muitas
Many
vezes
times they're victims
da incapacidade do Estado.
of the lack of government intervention and
Porque
support or the
a
state.
violência que existe na periferia
The violence that exists in the periphery,
é a ausência do Estado com políticas
it's
públicas
the absence of the state government with public policies,
para garantir sonhos à juventude.
so that we can guarantee some dreams for the youth.
A terceira coisa é a questão climática.
The third issue is the climate change issue.
Nós temos um compromisso
We do have a commitment
desde 2009 em Copenhague,
since 2009 in
quando
Copenhagen,
eu participei da COP15,
when I participated in the
em que
COP15,
nós assumimos o compromisso
and we took the
de
pledge
reduzir o desmatamento em 80%,
to reduce deforestation in Brazil in 80%,
diminuir a emissão de gás de efeito estufa em 39%.
to diminish the greenhouse emissions effect in 39%,
E nós cumprimos isso.
and we have fulfilled that
No meu
promise.
governo e no governo da presidenta Dilma.
During my term and during President Dilma's term,
Bem, Nos últimos anos,
Well, in the last years,
a Amazônia foi invadida
the rainforest in Amazon was invaded
pela irracionalidade política,
by political lack of rationality,
irracionalidade humana.
human irrationality.
The whole notion
Porque
of
nós tivemos
logic.
presidente
Because we had a president
que mandava desmatar,
that would send people to deforest.
mandava garimpo entrar nas áreas indígenas,
Gold diggers, illegal gold diggers entering indigenous
mandava
people reserves.
garimpar nas florestas que nós demarcávamos.
Yeah, same compassion for climate change as for racism. I mean,
Gold digging in indigenous people
Como
reserves.
reserva na Amazônia.
Reserves that exist in the rainforest in the Amazon.
E eu assumi um compromisso
And I took a pledge
de que até 2030
that till 2030,
nós vamos chegar a desmatamento zero na
we will
Amazônia.
reach zero deforestation in the rainforest in the Amazon.
Nós vamos fazer um esforço muito grande
We will take all the endeavors
para transformar a Amazônia
to transform the Amazon,
não num santuário da humanidade,
not a shrine for the humanity,
mas num centro
but
Wow.
the
de
center
pesquisa
for
compartilhado com o mundo
research
inteiro,
shared with all the rest of the world,
para que a gente possa tirar proveito
so that we can benefit
da riqueza da biodiversidade
of
da
the
Amazônia,
wealth and biodiversity that exists in the
para
Amazon,
ver se transformamos essa riqueza
so that we can transform this wealth
em melhoria da qualidade de
in the
vida do povo
improvement
que mora na
of the
Amazônia.
lives of the people that live in the Amazon
Ou
rainforest.
seja, cuidar da Amazônia hoje
So that is to say, to take care of the Amazon rainforest today
é cuidar do planeta Terra.
is to take care of the planet Earth,
E cuidar do planeta Terra é
take
cuidar
care of
da
the
nossa
planet
sobrevivência.
is to take care of our own survival.
E por isso,
And that's
todos
why
nós
all of us,
temos a obrigação
we have the
de
obligation
deixar para os nossos filhos e nossos netos
to leave to our sons and daughters and grandsons
mundo melhor do que aquele que nós recebemos dos
a
nossos
better
pais.
world than the one we received.
Ou seja, uma árvore de 300 anos,
So a tree that is there
se transformamos essa riqueza
so that we can transform this wealth
em melhoria da qualidade de
in the
vida do povo
improvement
que mora na
of the
Amazônia.
lives of the people that live in the Amazon
Ou
rainforest.
seja, cuidar da Amazônia hoje
So that is to say, to take care of the Amazon rainforest today
é cuidar do planeta Terra.
is to take care of the planet Earth.
E cuidar do planeta Terra é
take
cuidar
care
da
of the
nossa
planet
sobrevivência.
Is to take care of our own survival.
E por isso,
And that's
todos
why
nós
all of us,
temos a obrigação
we have the
de
obligation
deixar para os nossos filhos e nossos netos
to leave to our sons and daughters and grandsons
mundo melhor do que aquele que nós recebemos dos
a
nossos
better
pais.
world than the one we received.
Ou seja, uma árvore de 300 anos
So a tree that is there for 300
não tem
years,
proprietário.
no one owns that tree.
Ninguém pode derrubá-la.
No one can cut that tree.
Ela é um patrimônio da humanidade.
It's an asset of the humanity.
Ela está lá para nos garantir
That
sabe,
tree is
a
there
subsistência do planeta.
to guarantee the survival subsistence
E
of the
por isso nós
planet.
vamos levar muito a sério.
So that's why we're going to take
essa
very
questão do
seriously
clima.
this policy.
E lhe digo mais uma coisa, presidente.
Mr. President, I'd like to say one more thing.
É preciso que a gente estabeleça uma nova conversa
It's necessary that we establish a new kind
para
of
construir uma
conversation
governança mundial mais forte.
so that we can build a world governance that would be
Porque
more
a questão
stronger.
climática,
Because the climate change
se não
issue,
tiver uma governança global
if we don't
forte,
have a strong global governance
que tome decisões,
that can make decisions
que todos os países sejam
and
obrigados a
that all
cumprir,
countries should abide to,
se nós não tivermos, não vai dar certo.
if we don't do that, it's not going to work.
Eu não sei qual é o fórum,
I don't know what forum
não sei
this
se é
will
na
happen.
ONU,
I don't know if it's at
não
the
sei se é no
UN
G20,
or it's at the
não sei
G20
se é no
meetings
G8,
or the G8
mas
meetings.
alguma coisa
But
nós temos que
something
fazer
we have to try
para que a gente obrigue os países,
so that we can oblige the countries,
o nosso Congresso,
our national
os
domestic
nossos
Congress,
empresários,
our business sector,
a acatar as
that
decisões
they should abide
que
to the
nós tomamos
decisions that we make
a níveis globais.
at global levels.
Se isso não
If
acontecer,
this doesn't happen, Mr.
a nossa
President,
discussão
all our
sobre a
discussion
questão climática
on climate change
ficará muito prejudicada.
will suffer great damage.
E eu acho que nós não temos muito tempo.
And I don't think we have much time.
Urgentemente,
It's urgent.
nós precisamos
We need
tomar atitudes.
to take an attitude.
No Brasil.
We'll do whatever it's possible to be done.
Esteja certo
I can reassure you,
que os
Mr.
Estados
President,
Unidos
that the U.S.
e o resto do mundo
and the rest of the world
pode contar com o Brasil
could count on Brazil
na luta pela
in
democracia
the fight for democracy
e na luta pela preservação ambiental.
and the fight for the preservation of the Amazon rainforest.
Isso não é programa de governo,
This is not a government
é
program.
compromisso de fé
This is a faith commitment
de alguém
of
que
someone
acredita no humanismo,
that believes in humanism,
de alguém que acredita na fraternidade, na solidariedade.
someone that believes in solidarity.
Eu não quero viver num mundo
I don't want to live in a
em que os
world
humanos se transformarão em algoritmos.
where humans become algorithms.
Eu quero viver num mundo em que os humanos sejam humanos.
I want to live in a world where human beings are human
E
beings.
para isso precisamos cuidar com muito carinho
And for that, we have to take care very carefully
daquilo que Deus nos deu,
what God gave us.
que é o planeta Terra.
That is the planet Earth.
Obrigado, presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
And here's a take on it that is also from World Socialist website. That really pinpoints the democratic. I mean, let's be honest, right? Lula is a communist. I mean, there was continuous mention of solidarity. I think he mentioned it twice. And so it's definitely Democrat with a small d, and if at all, you know. And even he met with Bernie as well, and Bernie's not a socialist Democrat, but a democratic socialist. So this article says on Friday, Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva of the Workers' Party embarked on the first diplomatic trip of his newly inaugurated government to the U.S., holding a meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden of the Democratic Party in the White House. The visit was promoted as a sign of strengthening relations between Brazil and the United States. Both presidents have portrayed themselves as confronting attempts by far-right opponents to subvert the institutional order in the respective countries. In Lula's case, former fascistic President Jair Bolsonaro, and in Biden's, Republican President Donald Trump. I did notice as well that Bolsonaro is still in Florida. Just last week, he had a rally at a Trump resort. And in conjunction with that, yesterday, Lula monikered Bolsonaro a Trump copycat in a CNN interview in the U.S. So that's just a side note related to this article. Initiating the portion of the meeting open to the media, Biden said that democratic institutions in both countries have been very much tested and put in jeopardy, but in both the U.S. and Brazil, democracy has prevailed, he stated. Claiming to have a fundamental political agreement with the Brazilian leader, Biden drew the conclusion: I believe we have to continue to stand up for democracy and democratic values that form the core of our strength, not just in our hemisphere, but in the world, around the world. Lula, in turn, said he saw the meeting as a way of repositioning Brazil in the new world geopolitics because Brazil isolated itself for 4 years. In addition, he hailed Biden for having recognized the Brazilian elections and for his posture in defense of democracy. The PT leader defined the commitments he sought in partnership with the U.S. as the following. First, to never more allow there to be a new chapter of the Capitol invasion of January 6th. What happened in Brazil with the invasion of the government headquarters in Brasilia on January 8th, 2023. And of course, the January 6th was 2021. Next, he said, was an agreement to fight inequality, racism, and climate change, which we heard this. Lula's quest for a geopolitical repositioning of Brazil in relation to the U.S., as well as promotion of Biden as a defender of democracy, equality, and the environment, attest to the complete bankruptcy of himself and his Workers' Party as left-wing forces. The Brazilian president bowed to Washington in issuing a joint statement condemning Russia for its violation of the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So let's note there that that Bolsonaro isn't necessarily pro-Ukraine, and in a sense, we could say he's not anti-Ukraine as well. But relative to the United States, he is. While presenting pathetic plans to form a peace club among global leaders in practice, Lula is engaged in covering up the criminal role played by the main promoters of the New World War, U.S. imperialism and its incumbent leaders. It was notable that the White House failed to follow the usual protocol of presenting the two heads of state at a joint press conference after their meeting in the Oval Office. In all likelihood, the U.S. administration didn't want to risk the airing of any differences on the Ukraine war under conditions in which Washington is preparing to escalate its direct intervention against nuclear-armed Russia behind the backs of the American people. Shamefully covering up the criminal role historically played by American imperialism in Brazil and Latin America, Lula declared that the U.S. represents much in its historical, political, economic, and commercial relationship with Brazil. The fact that Biden sees Brazil and Latin America as a critical territory for the escalating U.S. confrontations with Russia and China is also complacently ignored by Lula. These bilateral efforts were critically supported by the pseudo-left organizations in both countries to help the PT, I assume that's a party in Brazil, and the Democratic Party in the U.S. present their counter-revolutionary policies as a progressive agenda, is the essential role played by these reactionary upper-middle-class forces. Among the few representatives sent by the Brazilian administration in its diplomatic mission to the U.S. was the Minister of Racial Equality, Aniel Franco, sister of the murdered councilwoman Marielle Franco of the pseudo-left Socialism and Freedom Party. Introducing her political goals on the trip, Franco declared, "My presence denotes and brings centrality to the racial agenda in this government and the efforts we will make to combat racism in Brazil," attesting to the government's aim to replicate the systematic use of identity politics by the Democratic Party to suppress the class struggle, the minister affirmed. What the U.S. can give us as a reference are their reparation policies and the valorization of the Afro-American history and memory. With the same goals, Lula's diplomatic agenda, including meetings with representatives of the pseudo-left wing of the Democratic Party and the AFL-CIO union bureaucracy, visiting the Brazilian president were Senator Bernie Sanders and members of Congress like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, connected to the Democratic Socialists of America. While helping Lula provide a left veneer for his diplomatic mission, these political forces are engaged at home in supporting the shipment of weapons to the war in Ukraine and the Biden administration's brutal attack against the American working class, such as the suppression of the railroad workers' right to strike. The claim that spurious relations being developed by Lula's government with U.S. imperialism are a necessary evil in the face of the dictatorial threats in Brazil is yet another lie. The theory that U.S. and European imperialism support would prevent a coup attempt by Bolsonaro was widely promoted by the PT, this is the government of Lula, and the pseudo-left during the Brazilian elections. However, the Biden administration stated support did not prevent the months following the election from witnessing an event more violent escalation of coup attacks in Brazil. The January 8 fascist attack on government offices in Brasilia exposed how deeply the authoritarian conspiracies reach with the Brazilian state, and they remain on the march. Meanwhile, Bolsonaro himself continues to operate freely in the U.S., with Biden's acquiescence working to consolidate a fascistic movement in Brazil. In one of the far-right rallies he held in recent weeks in Orlando, Bolsonaro reaffirmed that Brazilian elections were rigged and declared that the PT government won't last long. Despite the joint efforts of Biden and Lula to present their alliance as a powerful force in defense of democracy, the fact is the social and political roots of the fascist eruptions, both on January 6, 2021 in the U.S. and January 8, 2023 in Brazil, remain alive and growing. The World Socialist website wrote in its January 6, 2023 statement, 2 years on the January 6 coup continues. 2 years later, none of the social and political conditions that produced the coup have gone away. The existing institutions of the ruling class are breaking down under the impact of extreme social inequality. The consequences of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, a deepening economic and financial crisis, and unending war that's now developed into a global conflict. The threats to democracy can be answered neither by the Democrats in the U.S., nor by the PT in Brazil. As the WSWS has stressed, it requires the mobilization of the working class, unified throughout the U.S., Brazil, and around the world, on the basis of opposition to the capitalist system. So there we have it. Watch this space. And we will report more on that. And coming up, we have another story. Syria sanctions lifted. Caesar Act sanctions temporarily lifted for 180 days. Here is Jamal Thomas's take on the lifting of the sanctions. This is from Rumble, specifically from Sputnik, and the name of the show is Fault Lines.
The death toll from the earthquakes that struck Turkey and Syria on Monday, February 6th, has surpassed 21,000, officials said on Friday. Jeez. Rescue teams from several countries are currently aiding in both nations as they attempt to clear the destruction and rescue people from under the rubble. In a surprise move on Thursday, the U.S. Treasury said it is providing several months of sanction relief for Syria in order to allow transactions for recovery efforts. Oh, so the humanitarian thing came into play. You realize you're being sociopaths and making these people's lives demonstratively worse. It's appalling. Shouldn't have had to take multiple days for you to be a person. Let's keep going.
There we are. You know, I would do my time travel revelation to have us hear that again, but it's so succinct and upfront. I don't think we need to go any further with that idea. In complete U-turn, this is the cradle. In complete U-turn, U.S. issues temporary sanctions waiver to allow aid for Syria. U.S. officials and Western media have tried to portray sanctions as harmless, despite the fact that they've had a humanitarian, that they've had, despite the impact that they've had on humanitarian assistance for Syria. Russian aid workers and Syrian government of Latakia, there in the pic. And the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets, OFAC, on 10 February issued a temporary waiver for Caesar Act sanctions imposed on Syria to allow earthquake relief funds to reach the country following days of hindered humanitarian efforts. The Syria General License, GL-23, issued by OFAC, authorizes earthquake relief transactions, which would typically be restricted under the Syrian Sanctions regulations for a period of 180 days. Our deepest condolences go out to the people of Turkey and Syria for the tragic loss of life and destruction in the wake of devastating earthquakes, Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Department Wally Adeyemo said. As international allies and humanitarian partners mobilize to help those affected, I want to make very clear that the U.S. sanctions in Syria will not stand in the way of life-saving efforts for the Syrian people, while U.S. sanctions programs already contain robust exemptions for humanitarian efforts today. Treasury is issuing a blanket general license to authorize earthquake relief efforts so that those providing assistance can focus on what's needed most, saving lives and rebuilding, he added. The decision followed a storm of criticism as many have called out the impact of U.S. sanctions on the humanitarian situation in the country, particularly on relief efforts following the devastating earthquake. Bassam Sabag, Syria's permanent UN envoy, said on 8 February that international cargo planes have been refusing to land in Syria airports due to the threat of sanctions. However, others have justified U.S. sanctions, claim that they don't restrict humanitarian efforts or aid provision in any way, despite repeated UN warnings over the years and in the last few days following the disaster. However, many have pointed out that the sanctions are designed in a way that intimidates countries against dealing with the Syrian government, making it so that even when aid is involved, those who want to assist usually refrain from doing so due to the high risk of U.S. consequences. Senior U.S. officials have said in the last 2 days that they'll continue to refuse coordination with Damascus in any way, even going as far as calling it counterproductive. Washington claims to be working on the ground to provide aid through its NGO partners. However, even U.S.-based crowdfunding platform GoFundMe has canceled fundraising campaigns of local Syrians affected by the quake, who are attempting to raise money for relief. The fact that the U.S. Treasury Department decided to officially issue a temporary waiver for the Caesar Act serves as proof that Washington's sanctions indeed do pose a threat to humanitarian efforts. Yes, so may get into it with another one of these stories, but there's a State Department official, Ned Price, who just 2 days ago unequivocally stated that the sanctions are not hindering Syria from receiving aid. And then I presume there was a turnaround. Hezbollah, this is from Press TV. Hezbollah downplays U.S. Syria sanctions waiver. Hezbollah downplays Washington's alleged temporary and partial waiver of its sanctions against Syria, which the U.S. has recently issued under the pretext of facilitating relief missions in the earthquake-stricken Arab country. The Lebanese Resistance Movement's Deputy Secretary Secretary General Sheikh Naim Qassem made the remarks in a tweet on Friday. The American administration, with its implementation of the Caesar sanctions and blockade of Syria and its people, is devoid of all humanitarian standards, the Hezbollah official wrote. Syria has been a target of U.S. sanctions since '79. The U.S. and its allies intensified their sanctions against the Arab people in 2011, after the nation found itself in the grip of rampant and hugely deadly foreign-backed violence. Strengthening the sanctions even further, the United States approved the Caesar Act in 2019, targeting any individual and business that participated either directly or indirectly in the Arab country's reconstruction efforts. Early on Friday, the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control issued the waiver for the Caesar Act sanctions, allegedly authorizing earthquake relief transactions for a period of 6 months. The quake hit Turkey and neighboring, this idea, I think, that in 2019, the Caesar Act implemented that businesses that worked with Syria would be sanctioned as well. This is very interesting. And here's another one from Press TV. In wake of global criticism, U.S. temporary sanctions waiver for Syria. Washington's issued a temporary sanctions waiver to allow earthquake relief funds to reach Syria following widespread criticism that the bans are hampering international aid efforts in the country. The U.S. OFAC on Friday issued the waiver for Caesar Act sanctions imposed on Syria, authorizing earthquake relief transactions for a period of 6 months. Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Department, Wally Adeyemo, I think we got that quote. Yep, he authorized earthquake relief efforts so that those providing assistance can focus on what's needed most, saying saving lives and rebuilding. Syria has been a target of U.S. sanctions since 1979. Yep, we got that one. And the U.S. claims its sanctions have exemptions for humanitarian aid. However, experts say the sanctions intimidate countries against dealing with the Syrian government, and even when aid is involved, those who want to assist usually refrain from doing so due to the high risk of U.S. consequences. On Wednesday, Bassem Sabag, Syria's permanent UN envoy, said international cargo planes have been refusing to land in Syria. And earlier, the Syrian Foreign Ministry said in a statement that the sanctions prevent Syrians from importing rescue equipment. Other countries have criticized the bans, including China, which on Wednesday argued the U.S. To put aside its geopolitical obsession, or urged the U.S. to put aside its political or geopolitical obsession and remove its unilateral sanctions. Search and rescue operations continue in Syria. Death tolls at 22,000. The World Health Organization has urged the global community to lend a helping hand to Syria as the country's humanitarian needs are particularly high. The U.S. and its allies have ruled out the possibility of dealing directly with Syrian government in quake relief efforts. On Monday, State Department spokesman Ned Price said the U.S. will send aid to Syria through non-governmental organizations without engaging with the Syrian government. Yes, this concept of NGOs, we talked about that in relation to the Azerbaijani eco-activist situation. They are supported by NGOs, and this idea that the NGOs are not the government, it's kind of misleading because that's where they usually get their funds from. But maybe just that they don't, there's a facade that there's no political back and forth between a non-governmental entity and the entity that it's supporting. Okay, and from truthout.org, U.S. eases sanctions on Syria for earthquake relief. The 180-day sanctions relief came after U.S. officials denied that the restrictions would impact humanitarian aid. This is by Jake Johnson. In the face of mounting pressure from rights groups and relief organizations on the ground, the Biden administration on Thursday issued a temporary license authorizing all transactions related to the earthquake relief that would be otherwise prohibited by U.S. sanctions on Syria. The move, announced by the Treasury Department on Thursday evening, amounts to a tacit admission that U.S. sanctions could have impacted the delivery of humanitarian aid to the country following the massive earthquake and dozens of aftershocks that killed more than 21,000 people in Syria and neighboring Turkey. As international allies and humanitarian partners mobilize to help those affected, I want to make very clear that U.S. sanctions in Syria will not stand in the way of life-saving efforts of the Syrian people. And that's again Wally Adeyemo. And the sanctions relief, which will be in effect for 180 days, came after U.S. officials repeatedly denied that the restrictions would impact humanitarian aid. Earlier Thursday, U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price said during a press briefing that there are many hurdles to overcome when providing humanitarian assistance in Syria, and especially after devastating earthquakes this week. But our Syrian sanctions policy is not among them.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious. Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
But reporting and accounts from humanitarian leaders indicate that the U.S. and European sanctions, which have long harmed Syrian civilians, despite ostensibly being targeted at the Assad government, have hampered early aid and recovery efforts, compounding existing difficulties surrounding the delivery of emergency supplies to rebel-held areas of Syria. Freezing weather has also complicated aid and rescue operations. So there we have it. There is our update on the Syria situation. I'm sure we'll have more, as we do here at TR. We're going to watch this space, and we'll be right back.
It is obvious to the most simple-minded that Loci is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man. I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction. We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
You mean they should have respected us?
Of course.
Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again.
Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed.
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I'm chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, the provable.
You'd make a splendid computer, Mr. Spock.
Captain's log. Star date 11 February. Another time, Harrods. Israel's far-right minister says he's a fascist homophobe but won't stone gays. This is a January 16th report. Bezalel Smotrich, definitely want to keep a pen in this with him and his name. wherein there's a ton of information just recently about Palestine moving from occupation to annexation, as if it already hasn't. 3 indicators demonstrate the annexation is already occurring, and even if Israel is attempting to evade its consequences by deferring a declaration to a more opportune moment, first, the new government's founding documents indicate a clear and dramatic pivot in the organizing normative framework with which it's administering the territories, from the law of occupation to an application of Israeli domestic law. This is justsecurity.org. One clear example of this shift, let me make this a little larger for you. One clear example of this shift is an agreed change to the enemy property law, which will release property in the West Bank that was held by Israelis prior to 1948 back into their hands. The change in legal policy echoes a similar move made upon the annexation of East Jerusalem in 1967, signifies a determination that the temporary state of occupation has ended and that the territory is assimilated into the Israeli legal system. Second, the new government's agreed to implement several significant structural changes. A constitutional change already made facilitated the appointment of a second Minister of Defense, who's assumed responsibility for the military units managing civilian life in the West Bank. The coordination of government activities, COGAT, and the civilian administration, as well as the authority to appoint their heads. Importantly, the new minister considers himself committed first and foremost to advancing the interests of Israeli settlers. Furthermore, the government agreed to transfer the authority of the legal advisors to these bodies from the military, the IDF Central Command, to the civilian Israeli Defense Ministry. Importantly, throughout the decades of Israel rule in the territories, these legal advisors were responsible for ensuring that the occupied territories are managed in accordance with the international law of occupation. This change is coupled with the determination that the Defense Ministry's legal position on issues raised before the Supreme Court requires the approval of the minister, diminishing the independent professional discretion of government lawyers. It should further be evaluated against the government's radical transformative plan to undermine the binding status of government legal advisors' opinions, abolish judicial review, eliminate the constitutional basis for human rights, and assert unchecked power, which will allow it to entrench itself. These organizational changes transfer authority from the military commander entrusted by the law of occupation with governing the occupied territories to the hands of the civilian government of the occupying state. It therefore serves as strong evidence of changing the legal status of the West Bank from an occupation to annexation. And all these changes have already happened. So there's this groundswell, just like we heard in the Lula story, that democracy, all of these, outlets saying that there's something having to do with democracy happening. The term now that we're hearing is that the U.S. is standing up against annexation. Too late. Finally, the transfer of authority. Oh, my apologies. Hold on. Too late. Finally, the transfer of authority also reflects a change in the symbolic performance of power. From uniform military legal advisors seated in the West Bank to civilian lawyers presumably seated in Tel Aviv. From a historic openness to a two-state solution where a Palestinian state coexists side by side with Israel subject to permanent status negotiations, to a declaration that the land in its entirety is the object of the exclusive and indisputable right of Israel. We therefore conclude that Israel is presently effectuating changes which qualify as de jure annexation of the West Bank. Its deference of a formal declaration of annexation cannot serve to refute this conclusion. It is a simple attempt at gaslighting. And here's Noura, Erakat, Palestinian activist, on the current situation in Palestine.
Thank you so much, Becky. I appreciate centering that question and what it feels like to be a Palestinian, because so much of what's at stake is actually our dehumanization and the expendability of our lives, livelihoods, that our deaths become numbers rather than vanished dreams and mourning families. As I'm watching this, I'm having intense emotions. I was in Jerusalem in 2000, at the start of what's known as the Second Palestinian Intifada. I was there when one of the first of the 5 people killed on September 21, 2000 was one of my neighbors in Abu Dis. I remember vividly his toddler daughter beating on a picture of him calling for her Baba. I'm also then reminded immediately of my cousin who was murdered last summer at a checkpoint separating 2 Palestinian cities. Ahmed Erakat, I want to lift up his name because he remains in captivity in an Israeli refrigerator at Tel Aviv University, held as hostage, and not allowing his family, my family, to mourn him with dignity. I'm now bracing myself because on the one hand, I am invigorated by what is a Palestinian uprising against this colonial rule, and simultaneously bracing myself because I understand and see that Palestinian death has become an index for Israeli vulnerability because of the thorough dehumanization of our lives.
What we are witnessing today and overnight is this uptick in, I don't want to call it tit-for-tat strikes from Gaza and then on the back end from Israel, because tit-for-tat just dismisses the enormity of what is going on. But this has come off the back of recent violence in Jerusalem. And in a recent op-ed, you said, and I quote, Sheikh Jarrah is the latest flashpoint of Israel's expansionist project. The threats of eviction are part of what Palestinians describe as their ongoing Nakba. You wrote in that
violent juridical demarcations and its settler colonial plans of dividing Palestinians and eliminating them as a people, she cannot travel to Jerusalem and instead, like me, is watching it from afar despite her proximity. I heard the interview with Mark Regev. I had a lot to say to him, especially as he was sharing propaganda that Jerusalem has been the home to what he described as Arabs, he should have described as Palestinians, despite the fact that the Israeli government has been explicit about removing Palestinians. In its Jerusalem Master Plan of 2000, it says explicitly that it wants to maintain a demographic majority of Jews of 70% to 30%, and needs to do that because natural population growth of Palestinians will become 60 to 40. And so they have pursued a policy of removal through state annexation, through forced evictions, through retroactive taxes, through the declaration of land as state parks that are now off limits to Palestinians. 14,000 Palestinians have had their residency permits revoked since 1967 without due process. When Israel annexed Jerusalem in full daylight in contravention of international condemnation and 19 policy of removal through state annexation, through forced evictions, through retroactive taxes, through the declaration of land as state park removal, through state annexation, through forced evictions, 60 to 40. And so they have pursued a policy of removal through state annexation, through forced evictions, through retroactive taxes, through the declaration of land as state parks that are now off limits to Palestinians. 14,000 Palestinians have had their residency permits revoked since 1967 without due process. When Israel annexed Jerusalem in full daylight in contravention of international condemnation in 1967.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
These are facts. They're numbers. These are facts. They're numbers. These are facts. They're numbers. You can quantify this.
expanded Jerusalem's municipal boundaries by 10 times and annexed some 17,000 additional West Bank acres of West Bank land. Since then, the Israeli government has built some 49,000 housing units for Jewish Zionists in Jerusalem, but not a single one for Palestinians who constitute a third of the city's population. Nothing here speaks of equality. This is a settler colonial campaign to remove native Palestinians and to replace them with Jewish Zionist settlers in their place. Every Palestinian removed today from their home is not suffering from a real estate dispute, but faces their life now as a refugee for the rest of their life.
The rockets that are being fired by Hamas from Gaza, they say, are in response to what is going on in Sheikh Jarrah and in response to the violence, they say, that Israel has waged against worshippers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque over the past couple of days, over the Middle East weekend.
I do think it's important to note that it's the democratically elected Hamas.
Do you support that response by Hamas? This is an organization that many will say is filling a void where otherwise a wider Palestinian leadership might be. It's no secret that there has been a vacuum in Palestinian So at this point,
unfortunately, I think that the focus on Hamas rockets.
That's sad that how propagandized that is.
Which have been ineffective. Israel has protected itself with the Iron Dome system. Hamas has crude rocket fire that does not have the ability to target, is ipso facto reckless, and indicates the deep asymmetry in this conflict, which we should emphasize, which is a maldistribution of power that cannot be reduced to false parities. And oftentimes when I'm asked this question about how I feel about this rocket fire, it's a litmus test about my own moral compass. So here, let me affirm that Palestinians have the right to use force under international law in order to fend off that Palestinians have the right to use force under international law in order to fend off racial discrimination and colonial regimes. This law and this right is enshrined in a moment where the majority of the world was under colonial rule and domination. Now that we're in 2021, that seems incredibly anachronistic. And rather than focus on the absurdity that this colonialism remains intact by one of the 11th most military powers in the world, the only nuclear power in the Middle East. Instead, we are focusing on the tactics that Palestinians are using. That said, I think that the emphasis should be on lifting the siege on Gaza. They remain in an open-air prison, and as Israel now initiates a bombardment of the Gaza Strip, I want the audience to know that Palestinians cannot even become refugees of war because Israel has sealed those borders.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
Essentially, that's what Noura Erakat just said to the host. Your inconsistencies, I mean, the idea that with all of that violence propagated by the Israeli government, focusing on Hamas is preposterous. Absolutely preposterous.
Where is the United States in all of this? House.
Broadly speaking, is obvious.
position has remained consistent when it became Israel's primary patron in 1967 under the Lyndon B. Johnson administration, where it talks out of both sides of its mouth by providing unequivocal military economic support to Israel at the same time that it offers empty platitudes about peace and the two-state solution, which is essentially a liberal veneer for Israel's settler colonial expansion and violence. The Biden administration has signaled that it is no different than the Trump administration, which the world, was uproarious about because of his flagrant, brazen violence and disrespect of human rights. And yet the Biden administration has not changed course. When Trump moved the embassy, the U.S. embassy, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the world was uproarious, and Palestinians said, we're not mourning the loss of a capital of an inchoate state. We are now mourning the fact that we are told that we don't belong. And here is the Biden administration literally overseeing our removal based on the statement that we do not belong there and can be removed and placed anywhere else.
With that,
and with that, we'll watch this space. I'll open the channel.
Beam me up, Mr. Spark. Beam me up. Lock on transporters. Beam us up. Beam us up. Quickly. Beam us up home. Beam us up.
Prepare to beam us up, Mr. Scott. Beam us up, Mr. Scott.
Prepare to beam us up. Mr. Scott, prepare to beam us up. Have Scotty beam us up. Beam us up. Beam us up. Scotty, beam us up fast. Stand by to beam us up. Scotty, beam me up.
Beam me up.
Beam us up now!
Stand by to beam us up.
No need to beam me up, sir. The situation is under control.